How to Improve Your Security Posture with a Web Application Firewall, sponsored by AWS Marketplace. I'm Stephanie Wall with the SANS Institute, and I'll be moderating today's webcast. Today, featured speakers are Serge Borso, our certified SANS instructor, and Jeff Sweet, Security Specialist Solutions Architect at AWS. If during the webcast you have any questions for our presenters, please enter them into the questions window on the GoToWebinar interface. We'll be answering them during the Q&A session at the end of the presentation. You can also complete the survey that will be sent out to you at the end of this webinar if you wish to learn more about any specific solutions that we mention in today's webinar. And with that, I'd like to hand over the webcast to our presenters, Serge and Jeff.
Thank you so much for that, Stephanie. I really appreciate that. Once again, my name is Serge Borso, and we are going to be talking a lot about WAFs today. So the general premise of today's conversation is going to cover what is a WAF, a web application firewall. We're going to discuss a little bit about OWASP, as well as implementation, as in how you deploy a WAF to properly protect your workloads, and some challenges with that implementation and design and practice. All right, so to start off with this, let's go ahead and try to define what is a web application firewall. You've probably heard of this terminology. You may have seen it. You may be using one right now. It's not uncommon technology. It's actually very, very useful, high-quality security technology that's specifically designed to help protect our web application workloads. So what's a workload? Generally speaking, we're talking web applications and APIs. As in, we have a website. That website is sitting on the public internet, and it's being attacked all day long. Okay, so what a WAF does is it tries to actually prevent a lot of those malicious attacks from being successful. All right, and that goes, like I said, back to an API or a web application or other suitable type of technology you may want to protect with this. And there is, in reality, a lot of significant attack traffic that does come in from the web. That's just the very nature of being on the internet. You're going to get attacked. It's nothing personal. It's just the kind of course of doing business. That's how it works. So this WAF is specifically a device. This could be a virtual appliance. This could be physical. This could be cloud-based device that will sit inline. So quote unquote inline. What does that actually mean? Inline means that as the traffic comes in from the web/internet, that traffic flows through this device before that traffic then makes it to your web servers. Okay, so inline is in line with the flow of traffic. That's how this tool is able to effectively detect and ideally block that malicious traffic. All right. Now, as far as this technology is concerned, there are a few different ways to design how this will be set up and to get the most out of this technology, because it's not just as easy as turning it on and walking away saying, yeah, I'm done, I clicked a couple buttons. There actually is a fair amount of effort that's required to do this. What do I mean by do this? To deploy a WAF properly and to tune it and to ensure it's not only doing its job properly, but it's not negatively going to impact your environment, which is a real concern that we'll talk about here when we get to that here in just a moment. So the next kind of part of this conversation is really the premise. The premise or backdrop to this conversation is that, once again, we have an API, we have a website, we're being attacked. The thing here, of course, is that we have other infrastructure in our environment, whether that's in AWS or Azure or on-prem. The concept here is that we have other services we deployed, and a lot of those are going to be other security services. So a lot of us kind of think to the terminology of there's a firewall in place, and this layer 4 firewall is going to route, maybe not route, but block some traffic. We're going to allow port 80, port 443, port 22, 7389, certain services or ports through the firewall, and that's a security device. And it is. We may have an IPS, intrusion prevention system, an IDS, intrusion detection system. We may have our layer 7 DDoS prevention tools. A WAF is just one more layer of security that we can leverage to help defend our environment. All right, so part of this conversation really, and a question I get asked fairly regularly when I talk about application firewalls is really, well, since we have this vulnerability in the application that the WAF is trying to defend against and protect, as in, let's just go with something pretty common, SQL injection. We have a SQL injection vulnerability in our application. That's not ideal. To put it lightly, that's not ideal. Okay, so the question and kind of the conversation that comes up here is, well, why don't you just fix the application? That's where the root cause of the problem is, right? And yeah, you would not be wrong in stating something like that. The reality, of course, is that we don't always have the ability to fix that flaw. Not all of us are developers. Not all of us have access to the source code. Not all of us even have the time or the money or the expertise to influence that. And of course, a lot of times it's third-party software anyway, or a third-party tool or web app that we don't have control over. So what a WAF is going to do, kind of as part of that conversation, is act as like a virtual patch device, as in we can stop that SQL injection attack from being successful, even though the application is still vulnerable. Now, ideally, just to reiterate, of course, we want to fix the root cause, but like I said, it's not always feasible in a timely manner. The other premise here I want to delve into for a moment is the fact that there is a level of expertise kind of associated with deploying this type of technology. And the whole conversation here, I already threw out some terms, intrusion prevention systems, firewalls, WAFs, code base. Those are, you have a network team, you have an engineering team, a development team. Those are different facets of cybersecurity and different disciplines, which require, different levels of understanding about how things work, to kind of stay high level with this. And because of that, you may end up in a situation where it's not the cloud security engineer that ends up deploying a web application firewall. It could be, depending on your job role. And if you're the security champion on the developer team, this may be technology that you're in charge of researching, as in, what is a WAF? How can I add value? What's going to be the right technology for us to use? What vendor is appropriate for us? And because of that, my point here is that different teams may be using this technology. Is that relevant? Is it important? I think it is. And that's why I'm mentioning it. And I think it's important because of the expertise that an individual may have given their experience. They may be more prone to focus in on, let's get this thing turned on and running and move forward, versus let's enable this service and ensure that we're having the full scope of knowledge as it pertains to the impact this could have. Now, I'm going to say this probably one or two more times, but a WAF is a very powerful tool. It can do a lot of good for our environment. It just is important to understand that it has to be set up properly. And it's not like it's a super challenging thing to do all the time. As a matter of fact, WAFs are very popular. We see these all across the industry. The point of this graph right here is to try to highlight in a visual context so folks can understand that there is not only a lot of value you can get out of a WAF and a lot of popularity, relevancy, and adoption across the industry, but it's not just one technology or one solution that a WAF is going to be responsible for. We'll talk about OWASP here in just a moment. You may be, generally thinking or naturally thinking, web application firewall, workloads, APIs. This is all, layer 7. Let's block that traffic if it's malicious. And you wouldn't be wrong in thinking that. There's just more to what a WAF can do. Here in this example, as a matter of fact, you could see things like what database intrusion detection. You see denial of service or distributed denial of service at different layers. Of course, there's layer 7 application traffic that's going to be protected with the WAF. Even something like antivirus. You have a website. You have customers that are going to upload a document to your website. How do you know if that document is malware or not? And ideally, you'd be able to detect that before it makes it to your web server or your backend data store or your storage container, as the case may be. So WAF, versatile, popular, very, very useful, and something that we can get a lot of value out of. With that being said, there's also another kind of part of the conversation here that comes up whenever we talk about WAF, and that's going to be OWASP. As far as what are we actually defending against, there's a core rule set, CRS, a core rule set you're typically going to see with any type of web application technology. Any vendor you go to, this is kind of the overall, what are we covering? What value are we going to get out of a WAF? The conversation does kind of start here. You may have different use cases, to be perfectly clear, like geolocation blocking or capture implementation or advancing your authentication mechanism or things like that. That could be the initial use case. Like I want to implement two-factor authentication. And there could be other avenues that get you into talking about a web application firewall. Invariably, that conversation does come back to OWASP at some point in time, simply because a lot of us are in the position where we're implementing tools like a WAF, not for fun, but because there's a reason behind it, as in we really care about security, we want to do the right thing. Our peers in the industry are doing their due diligence by leveraging a WAF, and therefore that's what industry best practice dictates. And the elephant in the room, which is going to be compliance. As in compliance dictates that you need to be doing these type of things, as in having two-factor authentication, having complex passwords, locking down IAM, and looking at your web applications, how you can properly defend against attacks. So a WAF comes up in that conversation, and OWASP is always a backdrop, especially with the compliance component here. So you see the top 10 list, and you see 2021. This isn't antiquated. You should know. If you don't know, I'll tell you right now that the OWASP community comes out with this list every 2 to 3 years. So 2021 is the current list of the top 10 categories of vulnerabilities. So for instance, A01, you have broken access control, and A09 is security logging and monitoring failures. And there's obviously 8 other categories here. These are the most common, impactful vulnerabilities for web applications. There's a separate list for APIs. The relevancy here, once again, is that a WAF actually has this rule, like rules you can have turned on out of the box as soon as you deploy the technology, and customizations you can leverage to help defend against these top 10 risks. Okay. Now, like any other technology out there, a WAF is not a panacea. Just get to purchase or leverage a WAF and say, oh, I guess my job is done. We're properly defended against. Of course, that's not how it works. I'm not trying to make it sound like that's how it works. But a well-tuned WAF, I will say, can and likely will do a very good job in blocking many of these attacks. It's a formidable device. All right. Now, I'm not going to get into big background here, but I, as a person that does a lot of penetration testing and owns a small business that focuses a lot on penetration testing, including web application pen testing, I can tell you firsthand that trying to attack an application or an API that's defended by a well-tuned WAF, it means that probably literally 90% of malicious traffic that myself and my team will send will be blocked. All right. And you see other things here as well, like the A09, security logging, monitoring failures. What's a WAF going to do for that? Well, let's say the API, the WAF, the workload, whatever, the web application that you're defending against doesn't have advanced logging capabilities. As in, maybe it's legacy, code hasn't been touched in 10 years, and at that point in time, it wasn't really important to have enhanced logging, like failed login attempts, successful login attempts, things like that. Things we kind of take for granted in modern applications. What a WAF can do is say, hey, maybe you don't want to touch that code base, or no one wants to modify the legacy application and break it. So what we can do is we can enable enhanced logging at the WAF layer itself. So we have the visibility once again into something suspicious occurring within our workload. So these are generally what we're defending against. Top 10 categories. There's clearly a lot more we're going to be defending against. This is just definitely one of the topics that gets brought up a lot. Now, as far as the role of the WAF, this diagram here, I'm trying to convey to an extent what you can expect at, once again, a rather high level when you do deploy a WAF and some of the value you can get out of it. You see things like visibility and compliance and threat monitoring. Those are all real things. The other important thing to note here is the concept of legitimate versus malicious traffic. You have to understand that rolling out, deploying a web application firewall is going to result in the ability for us to stop malicious traffic. The kind of caveat is that it could also inadvertently block legitimate traffic. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment, but let's just be clear. Since this device is once again deployed in line, it's actively looking, detecting, inspecting, potentially blocking any traffic that comes into the environment, in front of that web application at least. And this is generally what it looks like. So the WAF has to make a decision based on the default rules it's been configured and deployed with, as well as the custom rule sets and any custom configurations that we've chosen to modify on that WAF to make a determination as to, is this traffic legitimate or malicious? And it's not as easy as I'm going to look at the IP address or the header, or it's like I have to inspect the payload. What does that post request look like? What does that get request look like? Do we allow put requests? Things like that. And the WAF has to make the determination to ascertain this is legitimate, I'm going to let it go through, or this is not legitimate, and I'm going to block that traffic. So it becomes kind of a bit of an interesting conversation here when you talk about tuning and leveraging the WAF. But generally speaking, this is what the role is. When you go deploy WAF, this is at a high level what it looks like. Traffic comes into the environment, it traverses this WAF, and then ultimately will either be blocked or allowed through. And another important thing to note here is that it's not just one-way traffic, as in you see the legitimate malicious traffic in the slide. There's also the HTTP response that comes back from the web application going back to the user's browser, as an example. So what does that mean? It means the WAF may not block a SQL injection attack because there's a bypass or the filter allowed it through for whatever reason, but the WAF could still block the dumping of the table information back to the attacker via the response, as in the typical response is 20 kilobytes, and this response for some reason is 2 megabytes. That's pretty odd. That's abnormal, and we're going to block it. So the kind of premise there being, it's not just what's this traffic look like, it's other heuristics that can be employed to ascertain whether or not this was a malicious request, or this is even a suspicious response, kind of like DLP, data leak prevention, to stop the leakage of confidential information. And that's what you get as far as that web application firewall being deployed. A big part of the conversation, honestly, though, comes down to the configuration and tuning. There's two general modes or ways you can deploy a WAF. The terminology will change from vendor to vendor. It'll vary, I should say, as in blocking versus learning. You may hear this as prevention versus detection. The idea here is that since the technology is going to be deployed in line, we have a WAF, we deploy it, we turn it on, we enable our rule sets, and it starts blocking traffic. That's awesome. Well, what if we're not quite ready to trust the technology to block traffic? Ideally, we're going to have a dev environment, a test environment, a prod environment, and we're going to deploy this to dev, deploy this to test. But then you start thinking through that, it's like, okay, cool, I deploy my WAF to the development environment. Like, guess how much traffic goes through the development environment? Not much compared to prod, or not very similar traffic compared to production. So it's not quite a one-to-one comparison. Well, let's go ahead and deploy the WAF to test it out. Same concept, it's not quite exactly the same as what you might get in a production environment. So you invariably have to go to production, deploy the WAF, turn it on, and there's still a little bit of a, if I screw this up, as in my deployment and my configuration isn't up to snuff, so to speak, I might block malicious traffic, I might block legitimate traffic. So I gotta be careful. So what a lot of companies do here is they use detection mode or learning mode, where they deploy the WAF and let the WAF kind of learn what normal traffic looks like. And then after a certain period of time, they gain confidence and say, for this workload and this tuning for these rules, I have a level of confidence it's not going to break anything. Okay, it's meaning my implementation of this WAF as pertains to this web application or API, as the case may be. It shouldn't break anything. It should block malicious traffic. But that's when you flip that switch, or you check that box, so to speak, and you switch from learning/detection mode to prevention/blocking mode. You actually get to block things. So here in the little screenshot down here, you can see there's other things we can do. It's not all about inspecting the payload and trying to ascertain is this legitimate or is this not legitimate. Some of this is geolocation and IP reputation and DNS reputation. So we can just block a lot of the noise that comes into the environment. As in, we don't do any business in this country. So I'm just going to block any traffic that comes from this country, whatever country that happens to be, that makes sense for you. Now, is that going to block and stop or prevent a motivated adversary? No, they're going to change the source IP and kind of get, bypass that. Nevertheless, a solution like that, or adding or a CAPTCHA, or what I mentioned before, like antivirus or anti-malware technology to actually inspect the payload, check to ascertain if it's a robot or a human, that has a lot of value for our protection and overall, risk reduction and process that we're going to leverage to try to understand whether or not something's malicious or legitimate. And it kind of just reduces the noise, reduces the threat, reduces the risk to a level where we can maybe manage it a little bit better. So once again, not a panacea, it's not going to block everything, and it really does have to be tuned properly to work well. All right, and there are challenges. I alluded to some of these already as far as deploying the WAF and then expecting it to do a good job. It's generally out of the box. I say it as if it's one thing, right? There's different vendors, there's different solutions out there you can look to. The technology you end up getting with the WAF is similar in what it does. Otherwise, it would be called something different. But the implementation, of course, is different. Okay, the way the tool works is different. The way that we can configure it is different. So there are some real world challenges in it. The biggest one, honestly, is blocking legitimate traffic. Like, that's a fear that I have seen come to fruition. As in, I myself had deployed a WAF and got woken up at 2 o'clock in the morning with a help desk ticket and a phone call, and had to go and figure out what's going on. And there's an outage, but it's not a complete outage. Some traffic is working, but other people are calling in and saying they can't access the website, or they can't make this payment on the payment page, or insert whatever would be a big deal for your company. And that's exactly what happened. And it's like, I guess I better roll back that change or modify that rule set. And that's a significant concern. It's a challenge. It's not. I'm not trying to throw you off of, be scared of this technology. It's, it could have bad consequences, but it is a reality that you need to be cognizant of and understand how to ideally prevent that from happening. Going back to the conversation about learning mode versus blocking mode. There's always going to be false positives, false negatives. That happens with any type of technology in this space, or there's not, one great solution to deal with that. With that being said, I lean towards things like gaining that level of expertise. That's going to help you significantly understand what the technology is doing, how it works, how best to deploy it, and what value you can get out of the WAF. So the challenges you see here are not unsurmountable. You can get past the majority of these. The big thing here is trying to get the buy-in you need sometimes to ensure that you have support with this technology deployment in your own environment. And then from there, it's just tuning and kind of honestly having the confidence once again to say, this is awesome technology. It's working very, very well for these workloads. We're going to kind of deploy this at a bigger, wider level here, so we have even more security across the enterprise. All right. So the takeaways here, we're not trying to ideally cause any harm with this, but you do need to be blocking traffic. All right. As far as going back to the conversation about learning mode versus blocking mode, if you're not blocking traffic, you're not getting the full potential out of the technology. Okay. Straight up. Dwell on that for a moment. You need to be blocking traffic. And I dwell on that for a moment because I've been in companies where after 2 years, they still had it in learning mode. And it wasn't something I had control over. I had the oversight and I could, make recommendations and add value and guidance. But if the business didn't want to turn it on to block, then they wasn't turned on to block. It's like, so what are we doing with this? Back to the compliance conversation, PCI DSS. Anybody here in the payment card space? PCI DSS, version 3.2.1, section 6.6. Those of you who know what I'm talking about, know what I'm talking about. Having a WAF deployed can considerably add value to your compliance program. All right. So very, very real part of the conversation, because that is honestly something that's a big driver behind the adoption of this technology. Now, with that being said, of course, this is a very affordable tool. I highly recommend looking into a WAF if you haven't, or you're not using one already. High quality technology, a lot of value, and when deployed properly, you can actually block a significant amount of traffic in your environment. With that being said, I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to Jeff, and we can get this conversation continued.
All right, thank you, Serge. Yeah, so my name is Jeff Sweet. I'm a security specialist, solutions architect here at AWS. I specialize in infrastructure security. So today I kind of want to highlight some of our partners that are providing WAF solutions, some experiences that our customers have had with them, and see if any of these scenarios and partners maybe can work for you. So AWS WAF is a native WAF solution that you can utilize. It's designed to be lightweight and easy to deploy to protect your workloads in AWS. It allows you to build your own rules that make sense for your workloads, as well as providing managed rules that are managed and curated by AWS and our partners. And we'll actually talk a little bit about that here in a couple of slides, because one of our partners is featured today. And it provides a lot of common stuff that you want to see in WAF. So geo-blocking, regex matches in the request, IP matching, et cetera. It's easy to enable all those in count mode so you can monitor the behavior and then move into blocking mode, kind of like what Serge talked about. There's a lot of rules that are provided on as emerging threats come out. If everybody remembers recently the log4j that was out there, we were able to provide a WAF rule that you could use to protect your workloads that might have log4j in them, and we provided that rule within 24 hours. So it attaches to a number of common services: CloudFront, application load balancer, API gateway, and AWS AppSync, as well as integrating with AWS Shield Advanced to provide layer 7 denial of service mitigation. But today we're here to talk about our partners and the products they bring that can offer you additional options and architecture. Let's kind of take a look at some customers that have been using those products and what they got out of it. The first partner we want to highlight is Fortinet, and we'll take a look at Fortinet. I think maybe many of you already know of Fortinet. They have a rich history in security products. Probably many people know them from their firewall products. Like I mentioned before with AWS WAF, Fortinet is one of our partners that publishes managed rules for AWS WAF. They publish a managed rule for API security, and that includes a lot of like IP reputation and threat intelligence that's built in their FortiGuard labs, as well as a complete OWASP top 10 rule set that, again, like Serge kind of talked about, aligns to those top 10 vulnerabilities and exploits and areas of security that OWASP keeps an eye on. But then we kind of want to highlight their FortiWeb Cloud, right, which is a WAF as a service. And it provides some really cool AI-based threat detection. AI and ML are leveraged to detect behaviors versus simple rule definitions. And that's becoming a very strong future for a lot of WAFs. And it's not to say that you can't build a lot of those basic rules in FortiWeb Cloud, but it gives you sort of that next step. It's pretty easy to deploy as part of your architecture, and it provides a lot of visual analytics about what it's seeing coming into your workloads. And it runs out of most AWS regions, and you can check it out in the AWS Marketplace. We'll talk a little bit about, if you're not familiar with what Marketplace is, we'll talk about it here toward the end of this webinar. There's a free trial, so if you want to check it out as we continue to kind of talk about this, then that's available to you. So I want to introduce BK Bank, and BK Bank's online presence makes them a target for a lot of fraudulent intrusion attempts. And BK Bank was recording somewhere on the order of like 80,000 attempts a day. And being that they're a financial service provider, fraudulent intrusion has a lot of impact into not just who they are as a FinServ company, but then to their customers as well. They brought FortiWeb into their AWS architecture in front of all of their critical workloads. Their workloads were positioned in regions that FortiWeb was available in, and then they also partnered FortiWeb with Fortinet solutions, specifically their FortiGate firewalls and FortiCMP. There's probably a whole additional conversation here around what that is, but I would definitely encourage you to check out their FortiGate firewalls if you're looking for a next-gen firewall with a lot of the newer features and functionalities for application detection and intrusion prevention. And FortiCMP is Fortinet's next step up in cloud security posture management. You oftentimes just hear it referred to as CSPM, and that's a great way to look at your cloud accounts and understand where security issues might lie in terms of configuration and other resources that have been launched and how they've been launched in your architecture. Definitely something you should check out if you're looking for that type of visibility. BK Bank, what they got out of the partnership was a big reduction in turnaround time for their PCI compliance. So as kind of Serge mentioned earlier, once you start introducing these additional security services, specifically WAF, you then can start checking off a lot of boxes around various different compliance models for how you're protecting your architecture, how you're protecting your user data, and how you're able to audit and maintain visibility around that protection. And they could demonstrate that improvement for their customers' financial data because they were able to say, hey, look, here's the level of fraudulent traffic that we're blocking. Here's where we were at with the intrusion attempts, and here's where we're at now. And with the products pulled together, they had an extensive view into their environment that allowed them to quickly know what was going on at any moment. And I think the quote from the CTO here kind of sums that up really nice. The broad visibility provides far easier and more proactive network management, and it improves the business processes. Next, I'd like to share with you our partner Barracuda and our AWS customer Smithfield Foods. Smithfield was migrating their external facing workloads into AWS and wanted a partner to work with to build security against threats to those migrated workloads. This is a very common position for a lot of AWS customers. Smithfield Foods was in that common model of they were based in a data center. They had a partner that they were outsourced with to help do a lot of their data center management. But their goal for the AWS migration strategy was to really take over a lot more ownership and pull that ownership into their own IT group and really have more of an end-to-end control over their own infrastructure within their own teams. Smithfield decided to turn to Barracuda CloudGen WAF. And one of the things for them was, as Serge kind of mentioned earlier, was where was their IT staff's technical skills in terms of deploying and managing a WAF? They really found the straightforward and easy to use interface very attractive. Getting it set up and up to speed and running was very easy. And I would definitely say, if you ever get an opportunity to check out the Barracuda CloudGen WAF, it really is a very easy WAF tool to deploy. So if that is a challenge that you are trying to overcome, I think this is a great tool to kind of take a look at as one of your sort of first priorities. What did Smithfield Foods kind of get out of this, right? So they ended up with a really smooth cloud migration and deployed and configured CloudGen WAF in a single day. Right, I think that's a pretty good migration story in terms of ease of use and timeline. It allowed them then to deploy Barracuda Web Application Firewall across all their internet and public-facing applications and have a complete view of where they were at. So definitely a great product in terms of ease of use and deployment. And then last, I want to talk about sequence security. Sequence security worked with Zoosk, and Zoosk may be recognizable to any of our folks out there in the online as an online dating app. Zoosk was challenged with preventing something that we refer to as romance fraud. If you don't know this term, if you're not familiar with this term, allow me to explain for a moment, because romance fraud is really focused on extracting money, extracting funds from unsuspecting victims. And it starts with either trying to create a fraudulent account that looks legitimate or attempting to take over an existing account with good reputation. And so once a scammer is in, it then attempts to find people to prey on, and usually does so with sob stories or something else that gains the confidence of a victim. And then they start asking for, like, hey, can you lend me some money for this situation? I have medical bills, or I'm trying to travel and I really want to meet you. Can you help me out? Or some story that starts to prey on good-hearted people. And if you're in the online dating scene yourself, you probably are familiar with the term catfishing, and this plays a big part of it. But what I would call out is, look at that $12,000 number. That's $12,000 per successful attempt. That's a lot of money. Anybody that looks at a platform and says, I don't want to be a victim of something like that, of that type of fraud, it potentially really impacts the confidence of users in the Zoosk platform. So this is actually a really good example where there's not necessarily exploits or vulnerabilities in their code, but instead a situation where real people or bots, I guess, were attempting to abuse a system in the way it was designed to operate, and that is to connect people together. So by using Sequence Security's SaaS solution, Zoosk was able to get on top of bots and mitigation for those exploit attempts, and also to get a better view of their risk and do analysis to what kind of threats were being attempted. Sequence's use of AI and ML allowed them to identify malicious and fraudulent users and shut them down or block them before they even finished the sign-up process. What that allows Zoosk to do is demonstrate that those fake accounts are disappearing. They're getting shut down, and that meant Zoosk's confidence amongst their own user base grows. Zoosk becomes a much more trustworthy tool to use. That's kind of another view of a WAF where it's more about how do we control bots, how do we control and identify user behavior, and then only let legitimate users through. So why AWS Marketplace? You've heard that mentioned. You've heard AWS Marketplace mentioned a couple of times. So Marketplace is a curated digital catalog for our partners, and it allows you as a builder or a decision maker to find and deploy those solutions fairly quickly. It provides a broad and deep selection of security solutions offered by hundreds of independent software vendors. And many solutions from the AWS Marketplace are well integrated with tools that you may already be using, which is why if you're a decision maker, you can really feel a lot more satisfied with the time that you're taking to evaluate products, and frankly, a better return on investment for those purchases. Speaking personally, in my career, I was a customer before coming to AWS. I used Marketplace a lot because it was easy to go find products that I already knew about. I could then also look at other products that were using and then deploy them into AWS. I used Marketplace a lot because it was easy to go find products that I already knew about. I could then also look at other products that were related that maybe I wanted to look into using, and then deploy them with pretty minimal effort. The partners that we highlighted today, Fortinet, Barracuda, and Sequence Security, they're in the Marketplace. A lot of them, not just these ones, but a lot of the other security services that are available through Marketplace, they've got free trials to check them out, as well as flexible purchasing options. So if you have products, for instance, Fortinet, that you have existing licensing agreements with, a lot of them allow you to bring your own licensing. Again, as a customer, that was really powerful for me because a lot of the companies I previously worked with had established licensing and purchasing agreements with various firewall products. And so we could deploy those products right out of Marketplace. just to summarize today, we kind of looked at the premise of WAFs, the security, the nature of security in the wild out on the internet. We looked at how OWASP can help you see the nature of that top 10 view of what type of exploits are trying to be abused out there, what a WAF brings to your architecture for security, and what it kind of looks like to implement. Some of the challenges, some of the ideas that you want to keep in mind as you begin implementing. And then we looked at some customers that are using partner products for AWS, how they overcame some of those challenges, how those partners can bring those benefits to those customers. I showed you the AWS marketplace and just highlighted that those partners are out there ready to deploy, ready to work with you for pricing and licensing, and how the AWS marketplace can make it a lot easier for you to find and to get products into your architecture. With that, I will hand it back to see if we have Q&A.
Okay, thank you so much, and thank you for those great presentations, Serge and Jeff. We do have a handful of questions that have come in for the Q&A session. A reminder to our attendees, if anyone has a question for speakers, please do enter it into the questions window now. All right, our first question is for Serge. I've heard about WAFs for a long time. Does everyone use a WAF nowadays?
That's a great question. Thanks for that. I really do appreciate that, Stephanie. So WAFs are not new technology. Let's be clear about that. They've been around for a fair amount of time, hence the question. They have been out there for a while. But does everyone use a WAF nowadays? No, not everyone. There's a point in time where this is more of a maturity thing, as in we're trying to do defense in depth or layered security, whatever terminology you want to use. And because of that, only more mature organizations had a web application firewall. There's also a point in time before cloud where it was tens of thousands of dollars to purchase a WAF, and no, not everyone had one. But nowadays things have changed, and it's not always just about maturity. It's kind of more of a, as I alluded to before in the conversation, industry best practice. Okay, the cost has come down to the point where it's very affordable relatively, and it is seen as industry best practice. Everyone else is using it. Not everyone, of course, but many organizations are. So to kind of reiterate a concise answer to the question, not everyone does use a WAF today, but many more organizations than even 5 years ago are using WAFs today.
All right, thank you for that. Next question for you as well, Serge. How good are WAFs at protecting custom APIs?
How good are WAFs at protecting custom APIs? They can be very good at protecting custom APIs. The kind of premise I'm thinking with this question is, maybe a company has this web application they deployed. It could be something as simple as and common as a WordPress application, and not a whole lot of maybe complexity there. Versus we have this custom API we've been running for the last 2 years. Now it's all in microservices in our CI/CD pipeline in AWS, and it's way more complex than what other people may have implemented. How good is a WAF going to be in that type of situation? And I'll go back to saying the customization you can get from a modern WAF will, generally speaking, be able to handle those complexities. Because here's what you can do. You can write your custom rule sets that are applicable to your own code base, such that you kind of get the best of both worlds. You get the default protection that comes to WAF, and you also get the customization and flexibility to create your own rule sets that can protect your custom API.
Good, thank you for that. All right, this next question is for Jeff. Jeff, how does WAF as a service work for someone's architecture, and how do we direct traffic to it?
Yeah, sure. So this is definitely a more and more common architecture type, right? And so there's a couple of different approaches to how this works. Some vendors, they provide their own hosted edge that you actually point your DNS entries at as the IP address to resolve, and it becomes the first step, the first hop into the architecture at that provider's edge. They can do the analysis of the request and then forward it to your private endpoint, or actually maybe even public endpoint, but the traffic flows through their service first. This is really akin to a CDN, content delivery network. It's very similar in that type of architecture. But what we also see now in AWS is with a couple of years ago, we released the virtual private endpoints for services, and so now with some of the routing changes that have also occurred, you can actually consume some of these WAF service providers in your own architecture, so that traffic, when it enters your edge at your AWS account, you actually route traffic directly through your partner into their architecture, where again, analysis is done, and then the traffic is returned and routed back into your environment and to the target that's hosting your workload. So definitely a couple of different ways. Additionally, there is the appliance-based approach, but that's kind of the traditional architecture versus WAF as a service that the person was asking about. So
the next question is also for you, Jeff. There was mention of distributed denial of service protection. Does a WAF provide that, or do you typically have to add it on?
WAF can become is part of the solution for protecting against denial of service attacks. We talk to customers a lot about good architecture that in and of itself can be denial of service resilient. And so a lot of the typical junk that we see on the internet that is, UDP reflection attacks and amplification attacks, that's more like the layer 3 and 4 network. And so denial of service attack mitigation providers typically are add-ons to a WAF. But if you're experiencing a lot more of the more modern layer 7, the actual application layer attacks, then your WAF isn't necessarily going to be the tool to do the mitigation itself, but it becomes a part of the solution. And it kind of varies depending on product providers of how much that integration exists for denial of service protection.
All right, this next question is for Serge. What about mod security? Is that an option?
Ooh, mod security. That brings me back to the day. I've dealt with mod security for many, many years. This came out a long time ago. I'm not going to get into a huge history lesson here. I will say that as part of the research I did for this project, I looked back into mod security as well as many other vendors out there. It does still exist. The support for this is going to end for 2024 through Trustwave, and then the open source community will then go back to maintaining the source code. So it is still an option. I don't know how viable it's going to be as far as support goes, maybe kind of on your own, but it is still out there.
Alrighty, thank you. And then our last question, Jeff, this is for you. You had mentioned AI ML techniques are emerging to protect workloads. How does that work?
Yeah, so this is really kind of a growth area that I think we're seeing develop fairly rapidly, especially as we start to see a lot of customers trying to deal with bot abuse that, again, is not necessarily about exploits and vulnerabilities, but trying to generate like business impact, similar to what we talked about in the Zeus example. And so a lot of customers are turning to some of the newer WAF models that use AI ML to do a lot of analysis of user behavior on your application and try to evaluate, like, is that a genuine bot? Is that potentially fraudulent or mischievous behavior? And extending that behavior, extending that mitigation out to the WAF edge. I think it's going to be something that we're definitely going to see growing as we try to more and more application platforms try to mitigate behavior versus rule-based, yes/no block type configurations. That configuration will certainly never go away, or it will always be there where we need to protect against exploits and vulnerabilities. But yeah, the user behavior, bot behavior is definitely a fast and growing segment of the industry.
Okay, great. Thank you for that. All right, thank you so much to our speakers. I really appreciate your time and your great presentations. And thanks to AWS Marketplace for sponsoring this webcast and the entire security series. To our audience, please remember you can also complete the survey that will be sent out at the end of this webinar if you wish to learn more about any of the specific solutions that were mentioned today. And we greatly appreciate your listening in. And we look forward to seeing you on the next webinar in the security series. Thank you and have a great day.